Good evening and a very warm welcome to the new Arab debates here in Cairo. Tonight's session is a little different from previous events. We have no motion to debate, no voting, but we do have a critical issue to discuss and an invited panel and a small audience. That issue is the prospect for human rights in Egypt, and this program is being recorded at the end of a momentous week that saw Mohamed Morsi declared as Egypt's first freely elected head of state. How high will human rights feature on his agenda? We've seen Egyptians go to the polls 5 times since the revolution, by any reckoning, a democratic milestone. But what about that basket of rights, individual freedoms and protections that also form part of what is widely understood as the democratic system? The Muslim Brotherhood has always said it's guided by a moral and religious compass. How will that impact on human rights here in Egypt? Our panelists are as follows. Heba Morayef, researcher from Human Rights Watch. Nada Umran, spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. Ahmad Sarhan, political activist and blogger. Hisham Kassem, publisher, newspaper founder, and a long-time campaigner for free speech. Eric Trager, fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Sally Zoni from the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, and a campaigner against sexual harassment. Welcome to all of you and to our specially invited audience, many of whom have a special association with human rights here in Egypt. Let's turn, if we may, first of all to President Morsi as the man of the moment. Heba Morayef, he's talked about human rights. Any sign that he has a human rights agenda?
I don't think it's clear yet. He's made general statements about wanting to respect human rights, about wanting to respect equality between men and women, but no specific commitments regarding the issues that people are most worried about. We've had a parliament almost dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, and some of the things that were discussed in that parliament are the cause of the people's fears about the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda on women's rights. So attempting to decriminalize female genital mutilation, attempting to repeal laws allowing no-fault divorce. These are the specific issues that I think President Morsi now needs to address, because that's what caused the breakdown of any possible trust, I think.
So you have no high expectations based on what the Muslim Brotherhood has been doing in Parliament up until the time when it was dissolved?
I think what needs to happen now is to have specific commitments and not these general statements, because these general statements don't resonate. There is a crisis of trust. This was a very divisive election, and President Morsi needs to address the concerns that liberals have with regards to women's rights, with regards to the status of Sharia in the new constitution, and the concerns that the Coptic community of Egypt have, to name some issues. Also, they need to address some other issues like military trials of civilians, which have continued and which they failed to stop when they passed a new law that allowed military trials of civilians.
Well, one of the first things he did say was that he was going to work for the release of civilians who were detained under military tribunals.
He said he would look into this issue. The Muslim Brotherhood,
it's a big deal, isn't it?
It's a very big deal, but the point is that the Muslim Brotherhood dominated parliament on May 6th, had the opportunity to actually try and restrain the military's powers to refer civilians to military trials, and instead they allowed them to retain this power. That would have been the moment to push back, when you had a parliament, a legislative authority that could push back against military encroachment on the justice system.
Nada Umran, no sign that President Morsi is that interested in human rights. He's made the right noises, but no sign that he's going to get to grips with any of the issues that Heba Morayef has been talking about.
No, I agree, first of all, that Dr. Morsi hasn't made a lot of commitments for human rights, but actually what we want to build in the next phase of democratic Egypt is the state of law. We don't just, like the previous regime, we just have pledges by the president that he's going to take care of the human rights, and that's it. We want it to be written, we want it to be there in constitution, and afterwards it should be there, the law, and everybody respects the law. That's what we are heading for, not just if Dr. Morsi mentions about it or not. And about decriminalization of the female genital, FMG, as they say it was not there. Muslim Brotherhood did not discuss it, and there was no decision about it at all at the parliament. It was just rumors about this. So it's a kind of, I mean, a lot of rumors. And
well, there's been a bit more than rumors, hasn't it? Because your member of parliament, Azza Al-Kharf, says she's no interest in enforcing a ban on female genital mutilation. On April the 23rd, she told Foreign Policy magazine, people are entitled to do what suits them. We have much more pressing problems. Actually, presumably those people who are entitled to do what suits them are underage children who are subjected to this form of genital mutilation.
Yeah, she called everybody to come to the reports of the parliament and to check the papers, and there has been anything about this in the papers written. It was just
No, I'm talking
free
about
speech.
her views.
Yes, her views is okay.
Her
but
views
it's,
are not very encouraging if they represent the rest of the
her
Muslim
own views,
Brotherhood.
but it was not discussed at all in the parliament.
So you're saying these views do not represent the position of the
Yes,
Freedom
exactly,
and
yes.
Justice Party.
Yeah.
She's out on a limb then, is she?
Yeah,
Sally
that's-
Zoni.
Yes, thank you very much. Azal Garf views are controversial and are fact-shocking, quite shocking, when you hear a woman rights speaking, a female representative of the parliament speaking about FGM as not as a crime, but as an option, as a choice for women. This is quite shocking, this is quite sad. It should not be left to the decision of a young girl. It's not even her decision, it's a decision of her family, of her suitor, of her parents. It's not her decision to be said so. On a second point, I haven't heard any statements that support women's rights whatsoever from parliamentarians from the previous parliament or even from any FGP members enforcing that women's rights are to be respected, are to be controlled, and are to be adopted. It has been left to very vague statements, any vague concepts.
Let me answer about this. First of all, you're talking about women's rights. Women's rights in Egypt in general is a kind of violated one way or another, not only by Muslim
Let's
You
just
said
stay,
that-
let's
you
just
just
stay with
mentioned
women's
the state
rights
of
on
law.
this issue, since it's one thing that seems to matter to
women's
people.
rights. Let me tell you one thing. The biggest representation of women in any organization of the world is in Muslim Brotherhood. We have 50% representation of women. And my wife is in Muslim Brotherhood, and she's activist.
Who
And if
are
we're
not
to-
allowed to vote in your internal elections? Women are not allowed to vote in your internal
Yeah,
elections.
they are not there because they are not part of the structure itself.
Which doesn't say much about your commitment to women's rights, does it?
No, they are not eligible to vote inside because they are not full members of the Muslim Brotherhood.
None of them.
None of them.
Is it
Hisham
possible?
Kassim.
No, just a question. Is it possible for them to become full members?
Yeah, it is.
If you don't get to grips with the kind of issue that surfaced almost immediately in our debate, something like female genital mutilation, if you don't get to grips with these issues, this risks colouring the whole presidency right at the start.
I don't
of
think
President
so.
Morsi,
Sexual
doesn't it?
I
harassment
don't
is
think so.
becoming more and more
Well,
vital.
I'm not here talking about each and every specific issue now about Dr. Morsi. Dr. Morsi hasn't go for 3 speeches to talk about FGM. He's not president of Egypt for FGM. He's the president of Egypt. So he's talking about something like global issues. If you want to
This is
discuss
a global
this,
issue and a
let me
concern.
finish my point. If he's going to be president of Egypt, he's not going to be a president for FGM. He's president of Egypt. So if he doesn't mention in his speech, it doesn't mean that he doesn't support it or he's against it or he's at the beginning. And what I'm saying at the beginning, we have to establish a state of law. The president, if Mubarak said, I can guarantee the freedom of press, but this is not enough. Let's bring the issue to the roots, to the real issue, not just coming here about human rights violation in Egypt are just being, violated by Muslim Brotherhood. Now we are looking to the future of human rights in
just
Egypt.
being violated. We're asking
So,
the question.
I find
we're
everybody
asking-
just saying what's
No, no,
happening to Muslim
we're-
Brotherhood.
We're asking
We
the
are not in
question
an
about what the
executive- we
Muslim
are not in an
Brotherhood is going to
executive
do
position.
about it.
We are not in an executive position.
Actually, you are.
We don't, where?
The president
What-
is from the Muslim Brotherhood.
We said
isn't
3-4 days ago. So human rights are
we
being
need-
violated
we
4
need
days
to
ago,
know-
right?
no, we'll actually
Not
talk
only-
about
I-
you
no,
in the
no,
future.
I'm going to bring Hisham Kassim here. How much do you think this discussion which we're having about human rights is a litmus test and a key issue now for Freedom and Justice Party and for President Morsi?
It's a little too early to figure if this is a litmus test. But what I want to say is, again, the approach has to be different. Okay, it has to be regardless of who came to become president. We cannot again go back to the mentality of relying on an individual to bring forward human rights. You see, so whether it was Morsi or Shafiq or whatever. Khalas, we've had a revolution, and from now on we should stay in politics as opposed to vote for somebody, bring him into office, and then expect him or her
But he's
to
the
handle
president.
matters.
He's got to set the tone, hasn't he?
Well, okay, so again, we must never allow that.
Never allow the president to set the tone for his administration.
Well, okay, not never allow that, but not to rely on that. Our input has to be there. Rights organizations, political parties, activists, etc., making sure that not only him set the tone. Okay?
Yeah, the military. will
And
as well.
again, the other thing is we need to rely on the instruments. Free speech is free speech, and the instruments have to be the guidance in setting the way forward for human rights.
To what extent does the president have to come to grips with the army and break the stranglehold that the army holds on this country to this day, still? Heba Morayef.
Essential, essential. I mean, the army is the white elephant in the room in this discussion. We're talking about what the new president will be able to do, and the president doesn't even have full powers. The army holds legislative authority right now. So all of the plans that I've heard about from the Muslim Brotherhood, which I think are interesting, so plans to do a security sector reform or media reform, things I'd like to hear more about, none of those plans can be implemented right now because the military will maintain that grip on power. And what I'd like to know is how far the Muslim Brotherhood is planning to push back against the military's encroachment, because the additional constitutional declaration that was issued gives the military a role in civilian law enforcement if the president asks them to do so.
They've already begun to push back, haven't they?
Not so far.
To what extent do you think he has to pick a fight with the army, with the generals, because that's what the crowds are asking him to do, not Amran?
You're asking me?
Yes.
He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to pick a fight. What's going to happen is that, as I said before, I have to repeat it so many times, you have to build a state of law. So we have to let this
What does
timetable...
that mean in concrete terms? Build a state of law. What does that actually mean?
Let me tell you the timeline. To stick to the timeline, we have to put a constitution which has the consensus of the Egyptian
Which at the
people.
moment will be written by people appointed by the army.
Now?
Yes.
No, they are not. Second thing is that I think most probably will have another elections, parliament elections, and then this will state to a very big extent the mandates and the power of the presidents. And this way, if we build this law in this sequence, I think we will have a very good and structured
how much
law.
this assembly differs from the other assembly? I mean,
Sorry?
this is the second constitutional assembly, and it's also formed by a parliament led by the Muslim Brotherhood. How this second assembly or second committee differs from the first one? And I can't see so many human rights activists on it. I can't see, I don't know, people of arts, people who are looking into the future of human rights in Egypt. And 7 of the members, I believe, or 10 of the members refused to rise or stand up for the national anthem.
Okay.
This is
Would you rather have an
actually
assembly
shocking.
appointed by the military?
No, of course not, but at
please.
least
That's a
show
choice.
us.
Help me.
No,
That's
but
a
at least show us. But at
Can I
least
answer
I mean,
this?
I'm asking the FGP to show us goodwill on forming the assembly, a representative
Okay,
assembly
no,
for the
no,
Egyptian people.
Actually, this representing everybody in this assembly is something which is impossible. These are just 100 members. And if you want to represent all the Egyptians' rainbow in this assembly or
Sure,
all
we
the
can.
professions, it's 100. And we decrease difference from the first one, that we were 37 at the beginning. Now it's coming to something like, I think...
But it's coming from the mainstream, the same mainstream.
70. We don't have a big dilemma with the Constitution. 80% of the Constitution is already agreed upon.
Okay, Hisham Qasim.
Well, okay, I agree that the president should avoid a confrontation with the military. We have a roadmap for handing over power within 6 months or so. Now, this roadmap, whatever it is, once we're there and we have a written constitution and an elected parliament, and I don't want to be taken on trust when it comes to SCAF, but at least we are
SCAF
then
being
in
the
a
military.
position, yes, the military, we are in a position to say, okay, it's time for you to go back to the barracks. Okay, we have a parliament, thank you very much, and then the situation becomes completely different at the time.
So no confrontation with the SCAF. How about confrontation with the ideologies and the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, look, I have to say I agree with you on that point, and I'm really disappointed in the way FJP have handled the Constitutional Committee. And I was someone who was critical of the Liberals early on when they got very aggressive with the FJP near majority, saying, wait. But I have to say I'm extremely disappointed, and it justifies now accepting a position on a committee given by SCAF.
With the SCAF, I mean, you've had over 12,000 military arrests, you've had detentions of activists, but under the Brotherhood, you're going to face an extremely intolerant organization. We just look at someone like Mohamed Morsi. Within the organization of the Brotherhood, Mohamed Morsi was responsible for the 2007 platform that said that no Christian or woman could ever be president of Egypt. He's also the person most responsible for kicking out Muslim Brotherhood leaders who disagreed with the organization's dogma, such as Abdelmonem Abdel Fattah. So right now you either have a military rule or a joint rule with the military or the Brotherhood that's both bad for human rights, or just the Brotherhood. So I'm having a hard time seeing a positive scenario here, and I find that actually very unfortunate.
Heba Morayef, I mean, human rights organizations, Western human rights organizations, of which you represent one, are unanimous in saying that while the SCAF is there, while the military command structure is still there, you won't get to human rights. You won't get to a realistic discussion of human rights. Do you still believe that?
Well, we believe this because over the last year and a half we've seen a series of abuses that have gone unpunished.
Which
everything
Trager
ranging
spoke
from torture to virginity test to killing of protesters. But one thing I would like to point out is, again, looking at the performance of the Muslim Brotherhood in Parliament, there are some issues where they have been positive on human rights. On the criminalization of torture, they put forward a number of proposals seeking to criminalize torture. Their proposals on some issues related to police reform. And interestingly, they had an excellent NGO law that was being discussed in Parliament. And had that NGO law gone forward, I think it would have really broken the grip of security agencies over civil society in Egypt. None of these laws were ultimately passed because Parliament was dissolved. So I am concerned about the future of human rights, regardless of whether the Brotherhood or the SCAF have the upper hand. But I think we are dealing with different sets of issues, and I think we should recognize that on some issues, I've sat in on parliamentary debates, including the one on the demonstrations law, where Muslim Brotherhood members were saying, we were the ones prosecuted under these laws, we don't want these laws anymore, I was tortured, this definition does not address what I experienced. So on some issues, we will get some progress, but on the other issues, there is a crisis of trust, and whether or not it was Brotherhood MPs who put forward some of these proposals, people believe that the Brotherhood is associated with them, and this is why we need those commitments.
Nada Omran, how do you investigate the abuses that Heba Morayef has been talking about that have taken place under military rule without having a confrontation with the military? How do you do that? And how do you bring justice to the people who have suffered in military prisons, people who have been tortured, widespread allegations of torture? How do you do that?
So actually, along with or having some laws or legislations that criminalize this kind of torture, let me talk about one very important point Heba mentioned about NGOs. We have proposed NGOs on 3 aspects or 3 branches, one of which is a strategic one. During the previous regime, just NGOs were working on the relief field only, but now we are trying to build 3 things: relief and development and strategic. Strategic, one of which is human rights. We have to legalize. We have to give it something like
okay, but
legal position.
Please go back to the question about how you bring justice to the people who have been tortured and the relatives of those who've been killed in demonstrations. How do you do that?
Yeah, of course.
Without having a confrontation with the military.
We don't have to. I mean, if they go to court
Maspiro?
again, sorry.
With Maspiro?
Yeah, they have to go to court again, and they have to have a just and fair trial.
And you think they're just going to accept that?
Yeah, I think so.
You think so?
We have the judiciary.
Salizani, you disagree with that?
Definitely.
I mean, who's not going to accept it?
If it's Maspiro, where the military APCs ran over protesters,
okay,
that's a confrontation with the
Who's
military.
not going to accept it?
And we haven't seen a strong statement from the Brotherhood calling for accountability for Maspiro, calling for the commanders who were there that day to be prosecuted.
Can I add that Samira Ibrahim, who was the subject of virginity test, had been accused and harassed by
I don't know why I
MPs.
feel in this discussion now that each and every problem happens in Egypt is the reason for Muslim Brotherhood is responsible. I'm afraid that somebody
Well, you got the
is outside. Why did the Muslim Brotherhood comment on these people who are tumbling outside? Let's
the joys of having the presidency.
No.
The joys of having a little bit of responsibility comes with the job.
We contradict ourselves now, which Ahmed said now. Why don't you do so? So I told him, we just had a president. Right. He said, I had a president. And then when it comes the other way around, Heba said, oh, he doesn't have powers. So let's fix one aspect. Let's fix one aspect, please.
Okay, let's be realistic, okay? Whether it's the FJP or anybody else, addressing these human rights abuses is not going to happen right now. We know lots of countries where an independent commission of inquiry years later, as the case is in Brazil, where an inquiry now has started in matters that took place between 64 to 85. But right now, nobody is in a position to challenge the military. Okay? So it's sad. I'm not in any way endorsing or approving of this, but I'm talking about the reality. This will come later.
People are going to be angry. I mean, they're angry now.
I know, I understand. But there is nothing that can be done at present. First, SCAF need to move back into the barracks, and then it might take a little longer until we are able to bring them under civilian accountability. This is a 5 to 10 year process, and then inquiries can take place.
I have just coming to my mind, you just mentioned 12,000 people in the prison. How many of them are Muslim Brotherhood members? Are the Muslim Brotherhood members immune? Were they immune have some kind of immunity over the past year and a half? from these kind of violations, human rights violations?
No, they have something like a deal with the SCAF that if they go and arrest somebody in the street, okay, avoid most of those.
All right.
Speak up.
I will take Eric's other point and jump 4 years to the future.
Let's be more global. Let's be more realistic.
Let's be global.
Let's forget
Let's
about
be
most
global.
of
No, but it is worth noting, though. It is worth noting.
Let's be scientific and progressive and
Okay, let Eric Trager have a
It is
say.
worth noting, though, that attacks by security forces on protesters tend to happen when the Brotherhood is not in the square.
Okay.
That is interesting.
And if they were in the square? Answer.
There's no attack. Right now, you have a few
How
hundred
did you
brothers
know?
in the
How did
square.
you know that? How did you know that?
Because there
Answer.
haven't been any massive
No,
attacks by
because you are
security forces.
thinking about this. You are judging the intentions.
Are you saying that in the last 24 hours there's been an attack by security forces on Tahrir
You are
Square?
judging by intentions. If the Muslim Brotherhood,
There
how
have been no
could they know?
attack on Tahrir
How
Square
could
in
they know?
several months.
Right.
Yeah.
Just a
In
minute.
about at least
Just a
6
minute.
months.
How can you define the Muslim Brotherhood from this audience? How did you know? Is this a Muslim Brotherhood?
Because the Muslim
How
Brotherhood...
can the SCAF know that this is Muslim
I'll
Brotherhood,
answer
this is
that.
not?
Because the Muslim Brotherhood makes official
No,
statements
that's
as to
your own
whether it's
imagination.
participating.
That's your own imagination.
And there
Well, you asked him a question.
That's your
let,
own
let him
imagination.
finish. Let him reply.
No, I mean, I agree with Hisham that it's going to be very hard to find justice in the short term for recent events.
That's
and that is,
scientific, yeah.
and that is the nature of revolutions. However, you know, in sort of talking about the future of human rights in Egypt, I think the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and their victory in the presidential elections is deeply concerning. When I speak to Muslim Brotherhood leaders about whether they'll tolerate Christians disagreeing with the Sharia, they say no, there are limits to free speech in Egypt. We do not have the same free speech in the West that we have in the East. They're very clear about that. So I'm very concerned about the future of minority rights under the Muslim Brotherhood's rule, much as I'm concerned about protesters' rights under military rule.
Allow me to take this point. 4 years to the future, 4 years to the future, 2016, are we going to have an environment where we will definitely have a free election again? Let's remember that 75% of the Egyptians who are eligible to vote, 50 million people, did not vote for President Morsi. 75% of them didn't vote. He got 50% of those who went to the vote. All right. So what are the assurance that to the community that he will give to the community that we will have free?
So answer your own question. Are you going to have a free election? Is this in doubt?
Iran has free elections, right or not? They have elections. By several administrative measures, they have what they call free elections, right or not? Iran, they do have. But the president will never come outside from this regime or from this new platform or this new boundaries. Gaza Strip. The last election brought Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood group, to the power, and that was the last
Morayef.
election
But if
ever.
I could ask you, both of you, a question maybe. Do you think that sustaining the last year and a half of military rule would have been better for the country? Do you think that a transfer to civilian rule would have come in any way other than elections?
No.
And do you not support democratic elections?
We do.
Because if that's the answer, then, you know...
No,
then
I'm just speaking about, we need to look into the ideologies, the principles of the Muslim Brotherhood. When we read their books, when we read what they have stated before, we need to make sure that the 75% of the Egyptians who didn't vote for President Morsi will have an environment, will live in an environment that allows free elections.
Which I agree with you, and I've
for
expressed
years
my
in the
concerns, and I
future.
have more on my list to talk about, but I don't think it's good to imply that Shafiq would have in any way protected human rights based on his statements, based on his performance as Prime Minister,
By
or
the way,
based on the last year and a half. And I'm not addressing this in your capacity, but I'm talking about the alternative that was on the table.
No,
and
I
would
agree, I
rather
agree.
deal with the alternative we have right now and say to the Muslim Brotherhood that the problem is also to do with the discourse, that you need transparency. We've had a year and a half of statements by the military saying we don't torture, we've never heard of virginity tests, we weren't there, there wasn't any live gunfire.
Excellent.
And we now need to know what are the deals on the table, what are the real commitments, and what are the compromises. Yes, realistically, it's unlikely to see any military officers on trial for killing protesters at Maspero in the short term. But what I'd like to know is what are the terms for the future, for this civilian transfer, which is supposed to be happening right now.
Not Amran.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I appreciate you're talking for the future. We're not talking about the past, okay? So let me just make one thing very clear.
Well, she
that
was talking about the past as well. She was coming to terms
make
with
it
the
clear
past.
so that everybody knows. Ahmad was a spokesman for Shafiq's campaign.
No,
He's not-
I'm trying to
He
look-
used to
I'm
be,
trying
okay?
to look
So
at the
no,
future
just to make it clear.
Nader,
Is
I'm
there
trying
something
to
wrong?
look at the future.
Is there something
No,
wrong?
it's not.
You are afraid?
But no, I'm
So,
just
making
looking
one
at
thing clear. You are the spokesman for Shafiq, so that's normal. Okay. I will answer your question. Muslim Brotherhood are the only, maybe from all what we are here, who have suffered from torture and prison from the previous regime for 60 years. Not you, not anybody else. We
That's
are
not
the only
true.
people. Listen
That's
to
not
me.
true.
Listen
The
to me.
only
Let me
people
finish.
is not true.
Okay? No, from here, from this group. Were you in prison for a while?
No,
I was in
fine.
prison.
From this group,
I was in prison. You were not in prison. Nobody here was in prison. I was in prison. So we are the real people who appreciate human rights. That's the guarantee that we are suffered. Dr. Morsi were in prison
Where
for
is the
3 times.
guarantee?
Were 3. How can you give a guarantee like what? Written something?
Spoken guarantees that we respect human rights, we respect women rights, we respect.
Morsi was there yesterday.
Not Morsi. You have the parliament.
So
you
now
have
it's
the
not Morsi,
president.
and afterwards it is Morsi. No, we're talking about who?
We know
Just
the experience.
let's fix one aspect.
We know the experience of the Brotherhood. We know this. We've worked on this.
We were
You
in
weren't the
prison for
only
40,000
ones.
years
You weren't
in
the
total.
only
40,000
ones.
years, you know.
You weren't the only ones. Coptic Christians suffered under Hosni Mubarak. Women's rights were discriminated
Okay,
against under
exactly.
Hosni Mubarak. The Shia of
Okay,
Egypt.
please
The
let her
Baha'is of
finish. You
Egypt.
had a say. Please let her
The
finish.
Baha'is of Egypt. And the reason there is a crisis of trust within the human rights community is that let's talk about military trials.
Okay.
By September, there had already been 10,000 civilians tried before military tribunals. Not a statement from the Muslim Brotherhood criticizing something which they campaigned about. The Muslim Brotherhood introduced us to the military trials. Khairat al-Shatir was sentenced by a military tribunal.
Exactly.
And yet we didn't get this kind of solidarity in the human rights community from the people who had suffered most. That you can explain it for political reasons. You can say again that that wasn't the right time to challenge the military, and that's an argument I understand.
Okay.
But this is the reason there is a crisis of trust. And on human rights, these are part of your public policy. And again, May 6, you had the opportunity as the Muslim Brotherhood to try and limit the powers of the military or to try and change accountability for the military, and it was retained as it stood. And that is, again, why
Okay,
people are
I'm
questioning.
going to give you a chance to answer that in a second. I just want to point out to the audience that we would like your questions. If you have any questions relating to exactly what we're discussing, please put your hands up and we'll get to you in a moment. Nada Amran, you want to answer the points that Heba Morayef has just made?
Yeah, I agree with her. I agree that we haven't made, yes, and we confess that we made mistakes during the past 1.5 years. And Dr. Morsi said,
And you should have been clearer about what was taking place.
But this is not the main issue. I mean, if we had made this statement,
Well, her point is that it leads to a crisis in trust.
Exactly.
That's her
no,
point.
no,
It's
no.
mine.
That's her point.
That doesn't lead.
And that's Ali Zoni's point.
Yeah. You mean that's the main that's the main point?
That's the start.
That's the only one. That's the only thing that you need for human rights in Egypt that Muslim Brotherhood criticize or support doesn't support, or your effort and to establish real laws that really protects the human rights, which is more important to me. I don't
Ali
understand.
Zoni.
Which is more important? Commitments or?
I mean, Muslim Brotherhood just issue a statement, or to really build the law for human rights, for NGOs and for human rights, and to be stated in the law, or I can tell you now the statement if you want.
Of course not. The statement is the least of commitments. It's the basic commitment. It's to say, yes, we know and we admit and we demand and we support. You said rule of law and state of law. That's the most important. A law against FGM should be kept.
Exactly.
A law against sexual harassment should be established. A law to protect every person's right to speech, every person's equal in front of the law, equal citizenship for everyone. It is not a state dominated by one factor who writes the constitution and who speaks on behalf of Egyptians. It's the state of diversity. And I don't see it reflected that way. I see it one people speaking up and others like pledging or asking for them to give them space, which is not how it should be going.
All right, gentleman over there has a question.
Yes, good evening. My concern is that we need a definition of human rights. What do you mean by human rights, first of all? And we need to make sure that people first are treated as humans. Because when you go in the streets and you see that the normal Egyptian citizen dream is to have clean water, good food, and good health care, this is inhuman. Before we talk about freedom of speech or women's rights or so on, whether they're allowed to wear bikinis and so on, we need first to upgrade the dreams of the Egyptians about human rights.
There's no conflict. The human rights framework recognizes the right to health, education, work, labor rights, and
I'm
another
not talking about a
interesting
conflict,
issue.
I'm talking about the emphasis.
But what I think is dangerous is to say bread first, because Hosni Mubarak used to say that in many of his speeches. We want bread first, and in the meantime, people were being tortured. Exactly. So there is no conflict in terms of prioritization. You can work on both at the same time. You can have legislation that looks at the right of independence.
But you think the people who care about bread also care about free speech?
Well, these are the people who are being abused by the police because they're poor, because they're being dragged in and they're being beaten up and being told, give me the confession, I want to close this theft case. So police abuse is a cross-class experience. So you can't say, just give us bread, just give us employment in the way that Muammar Gaddafi said, or many of the Gulf states will say, and take away our political freedoms. I think that discourse should be something of the past. The Arab Spring should have broken.
Okay, Eric Trager.
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that the human rights problems that we see in Egypt didn't start with the Brotherhood at all. The stances against women, the hostility towards Christians is very unfortunately a real element in Egyptian society that has to be dealt with. I think the fear, though, is that the Brotherhood will only make that worse, or at the very least, keep the kinds of intolerance that Egyptians have had to deal with for a very long time.
The human rights abuses that took
I
place
don't know
in
what
Egypt.
we're talking about, actually. I don't know what's the course of talking. We're talking about simultaneous human rights, and then went to elections, and then went to another. Let's.
I'm trying to bring this to a track, and I want to pursue this with Eric Trager, that the abuses that took place under the old regime took place with Western connivance, didn't they? The West had no interest. The West had no interest in human rights.
The West did not.
Does the West have any interest now in seeing genuine human rights
I think
in
the West does have an interest in seeing human rights in Egypt.
Because its record is pretty poor, isn't it? Where Egypt is concerned.
I think it's important to emphasize the West did not create Hosni Mubarak. Hosni Mubarak was president
Nobody
of
turned a
Egypt.
blind eye to all his excesses, didn't
Propped
they?
him up.
The West, and especially I should say the United States, tried, especially during the last decade, to communicate to Hosni Mubarak that he had to open up his political system. The Bush
Tried in what way?
the
They
Bush
never tied it to
administration-
aid,
the Bush
did they?
administration
They never tied
sidelined
it to
him,
aid. They never tied
sidelined
it
him.
to aid.
They never tied it to military aid, but military aid is a symbol of the strategic cooperation between the United States and Egypt. It is separate from the real political issues that were addressed during the course of the last decade.
Heba
They
Morayef.
tried temporarily in 2005, and then Hamas won the elections, and then the freedom agenda became a lot less popular. I don't think we need to kid ourselves about the fact that the West and the United States in particular bought the Mubarak regimes. It's either me or chaos discourse for years and years, and did prop him up. Yes, they would raise the odd human rights abuse here and there, but the response that I would get when I was doing advocacy would be a sort of, Heba, be pragmatic, we have strategic interests, so we can't push very hard.
Hisham Kassim.
Look, this was always for local consumption, like they say, but there was never any interest. I remember in 2000, one of the European countries decided they were going public with their national human rights report. And I was asked the question, and I said, what difference does it make? The State Department writes a very good report, and it's not a component of American foreign policy. And all these reports will do is confuse a researcher working 50 years from now, where there's very strong discourse in support of human rights, etc., but in practice, the support is all going to the dictators. And I don't think that this has changed. I'm in touch enough with American and European politicians, and I know the situation has not changed.
So you don't believe they have more of an interest in seeing human rights established?
No.
They
The
don't
security
care?
and the
They just look for
stability
their own
is-
interests
yeah.
in the region. They don't care.
Eric Trager.
But there's a hypocrisy here, isn't there? Because on one hand, you want the United States in particular to put human rights first. And on the other hand,
I don't want them to put human rights. I don't want them to be here at all.
Exactly.
Neither to support human rights or don't
That's
support.
exactly my point.
This is not your region.
Okay, let him come back. Let him come back.
You're right, we're 6,000
It's
miles
not
away.
hypocrisy.
No,
But the point
let
is-
him finish.
Okay.
The point is that on one hand, you want the United States to put human rights first, and on the other hand, when they do that, when they, for example, support pro-democratic NGOs, you say that it's interference. When they capture American NGO workers, the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't stand up, and when they're then pulled out of the country, the Muslim Brotherhood says that it was the justice system that failed and allowed Americans who were being brought up on purely politicized charges to leave. So there's a hypocrisy.
So let me make it clear two things. First of all, I didn't say hypocrisy means that we are supporting the United States to interfere or not interfere. We don't support. We're talking about Muslim Brotherhood. This is nothing had to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm talking about Egyptians. We don't want you to come and to interfere for your own interest, which is that it's the only thing that you care for. You don't care for human rights. You don't care for anything because you see human rights are being violated in Israel for 60 years, and you turn a blind eye to what happens in Gaza and Israel, and then when you come to Egypt, I'll say this man has been violated or something. So you are unjust. And at the same time, we are not saying that you should support, but we are saying that just say the truth about happening in Israel and don't interfere in our society. And listen to this and don't judge it.
Okay, Eric Trager.
No,
Don't judge it. It's
Let
don't
him,
judge the
look,
intentions.
you've made your point.
Okay.
Let him come back.
human rights promotion
Okay.
has been an element of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. That's why we supported pro-democratic NGOs here. And when we did that, it backfired on us. And my question is, where was the Muslim Brotherhood when our NGOs were being raided in December, when our NGO workers were being arrested or threatened with arrest in January? Where were they?
Can I answer?
So the point is, on one hand, you want a U.S. foreign policy that puts human rights first, and then when we do that and we get slapped in the face for it, you're nowhere to be found.
Because
Okay,
I
Nadam
agree
Ran.
with your point, by the way, on that.
Thank
yes.
You agree with
Yes,
what you
of
said?
course,
Nadam Ran.
certainly.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't agree with you that you are supporting human rights in Egypt. That's why the whole story I don't agree with. Because you're not supporting, you're supporting your own interest, and that's the only one you care for.
But so
That's
supporting
the only one I
NGOs that will
understand.
help build democratic institutions here is supporting our own interests, or is it trying to help build institutions that will make for a more equitable
No,
society
it's
here?
two things. First of all, helping your interests. Second thing, it's an intelligence work. Okay?
That,
You know
that,
this.
that is
I-
not
I-
really fair.
No,
I
no,
don't
that's
think
my
that's a-
opinion.
I
Why
don't
don't you
think that's a
respect it?
productive
That's
line of
intelligence
argument.
work, yeah.
What's your evidence for
And-
saying that? What evidence do you have for saying
I
that?
have my own.
What evidence?
I'll let you know.
You've made the accusation, so let's see the evidence. in context.
We have.
Otherwise, it's just a smear, isn't it?
No.
Nadam Ran? It's just a smear.
We have some months ago.
It's a cheap shot, isn't
Okay,
it?
no.
Well, where's the
I'll
evidence?
tell you the
Where's
evidence.
the evidence? Where's the evidence?
I'll tell you the evidence. Can I speak? Sure.
So, nobody's preventing you.
Okay. My evidence is there is a case in the court now, which was the people was freed just on bail some month ago.
And the Egyptians are still there.
Yeah, and the Egyptian prisoners.
Case in court is evidence?
Yes.
It's
No.
evidence?
I'm telling you the story, and they are still being there. And still being there, I mean, the Egyptians are still in prison, and the Americans were released and went to America for this work of spying, right?
Believe
After
me, this is
politicized investigation.
extremely unfair.
I don't care.
Okay, there is
Hisham
no
Kassam.
evidence of that whatsoever. And in fact, check the record of the two judges who took that case and how many of the Muslim Brotherhood they have
You
thrown.
know them. They're
in.
state security
I don't care.
prosecutors.
Okay.
Abu
I don't
Zaid and
care. It's still
Ashmel.
there in the
so-
judiciary. I'm not going to judge the judges.
No,
I'm talking
you do
about the
judge
judiciary.
The Brotherhood has experienced the judiciary and how certain sections of the Egyptian judiciary are completely
now we are not
politicized.
we are not
No,
talking
no,
about
but
respect.
okay,
Let her
no,
finish.
no,
Let her
please,
finish.
just don't give me the response that the judiciary is above criticism, because you have been criticizing the judiciary to me over the past years. You know this. You've experienced politicized trials. You've experienced qadaya mulaffa'a, as we say in Arabic. You've experienced how judges renewed emergency detention orders. I think this myth of an independent judiciary, which we must protect at all costs, is a destructive one to maintain. The judiciary in Egypt has a mixed record. Some of the judges are independent and stand up and criticize the government and uphold the rule of law, and others are politicized and take phone call orders.
Nadam
And-
Ran, let him come back on that.
Okay, so if we are going to discuss judiciary, so nothing, I cannot prove anything. But if we are respecting judge as we are talking about, so there's a case in court now.
Now, check
So what can I say?
Samah Abu Zaid and
I don't know the judges, actually. I've never heard about the judges.
You should check, because I'm surprised
care.
that you make a case of espionage when you don't even know who the judges in the case are. No, you need much more.
Do I have to?
Certainly.
Do you have to the names of the judges?
You need
And
much more
And
information.
judge them if they are good or
And
bad?
what are the charges? There's no charges. The charges, they had a press conference where they spoke about maps, etc., and there's been a complaint filed against them because by law they should not have had that press conference.
Okay.
Okay. We're
I
really
don't
talking
care
here
for the
about a
judges.
case where somebody
I'm
was
talking
trying
there
to
is
create a
case.
crisis.
Yeah, I'm talking about intelligence, which is interfering. I mean, work intelligence, and
But
you
you
said
have
you
no
have to have
evidence
the
of
You're
evidence.
talking about rumors and you have no evidence to
No,
produce.
I have the evidence, which
It's
is
very
the
disturbing
case.
Where is it?
that you would call pro-democratic NGOs trying to build institutions here foreign intelligence
No,
services.
I'm not talking
that
about
does
this.
not suggest.
And I said American human rights, one of which has a case in court. That's what I said.
Okay, gentlemen over there, you have a question.
Going to the real hardcore issues, I believe, is the real battle for human rights right now will be the Constitution, the drafting of the new Constitution. I think that's what we need to be talking about. The Constitution and the independence of judiciary. Those are the two safety valves for protecting human rights in the future. Thank you.
Sally Zoni, would you agree with that?
I definitely agree. Constitution is where it all comes up to, and I'm very skeptical on how it will be written and who will represent who. As we all know, it's more or less dominated by an Islamic tendency, an Islamic ideology, including and excluding, judges, students, liberals, socialists, whatsoever, all in a confrontation of Islamic domination. And it's quite sad. Again, I'll be stressing on the representation of half of the society, of women. it's still very sad, and it's still very shocking, and it's still very alarming. Constitution will stay there for a long time. It's unlike the president that can come and go in 4 years. It's unlike the parliament that can be dissolved very recently. The constitution will be there. And look at Iraq, for example, and they're still battling with a constitution that has been drafted and set, and very hard to change and very hard to stand against.
Now, Amran, brief comment,
yes.
and then we have to wrap.
Yeah, my final is question for you, Tim. So why did you ask me for evidence for my accusation while everybody else made lots of accusations from the beginning and you didn't ask for evidence?
Because this was very specific, because this
No.
referred to a court case. This was very specific.
You
It's
believe so?
espionage. That's
Espionage is a big accusation.
And treason and deals with the SCAF and everything. All
These
this,
are not formal charges. These
I
are
didn't
not
say.
charges in the case.
1 minute. 1 minute. I didn't say these are. I didn't ask for evidence for anybody who is accusing me. But you just asked for evidence.
Why did you mind the question so much? Let me turn it back to you.
Yeah, because you said it's just like this. You have to have evidence. You made it like
Well,
this.
you said that spying had taken place. I wondered what your evidence was.
I'm
I think
asking about your question.
I think everybody on the panel
I asked
wanted
it,
to know.
why did you ask me for evidence for the only accusation I made while everybody is making many accusations?
It's an accusation of different nature. It's not the same.
No.
Now,
It is an
now, the
accusation.
accusation
it is a very
that,
different
that people are foreign spies is something that was used under the old regime. And frankly, when you made it,
Or
when you said
betray
that,
your own country,
it simply
when you
affirmed-
betray your own country, like what you're saying about Muslim Brotherhood, you're betraying your own country. This is not a big
Nobody said
accusation.
the Brotherhood
I didn't
made
say
that
that.
accusation.
I didn't say that. When we are making deals and we leave the people in the street not to be for the prisoners, we don't care. We don't issue. Okay, I take everything. I mean, easy. But when I made just one accusation, you take it for granted, and I found you like this, and then what's your evidence?
That's
is like
an
this.
accusation that sounds
I don't
awfully
want to
like,
answer.
awfully
Actually, what I
like the
want
old
is just to
regime.
make this point clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We started in controversy an hour ago. We've ended now in controversy. I want to thank our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much for coming here tonight. Also to you, the audience. For now, that's it from the New Arab Debates in Cairo. We hope to be back sometime in the future. Thanks very much indeed for being here. Good night. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.